From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. Jane of George Street. The poignant story of the ghost of George Street, Edinburgh, was told to me by a friend in the years shortly before World War I. My friend laid no claims to possessing any special psychic powers. His was a very open mind. Here, from my notebooks, he recounts his experiences in his own words. I was walking in a leisurely way along George Street one day, towards Strunnell's, where I get my cigars, and had arrived opposite, when I suddenly noticed just ahead of me a tall woman of remarkably graceful figure, clad in a costume which, even to an ignoramus in fashions like myself, seemed extraordinarily out of date. In my untechnical language, it consisted of a dark blue coat and skirt trimmed with black braid. The coat had a very high collar, turned over to show a facing of blue velvet. Its sleeves were very full at the shoulders, and a band of blue velvet drew it tightly in at the waist. Moreover, unlike every other lady I saw, she wore a small hat, which I subsequently learned was a toque, with one white and one blue plume placed moderately high at the side. The only other conspicuous items of her dress, the effect of which was, on the whole, quiet, were her white glacé gloves, over which dangled gold curb bracelets with innumerable pendants, though I also noticed her shoes, which were of patent leather, with silver buckles and rather high Lewis heels, and her fine blue silk open-work stockings. She was a strikingly fair woman, with very pale yellow hair, and seemed on a fleeting view to have a startlingly white complexion, a peculiarity which so impressed me that I hurried along, determining to get a good look at her. Passing her with rapid strides, I looked back, and as I did so, a cold chill ran through me, for what I looked at was the face of the dead. Shocked and bewildered, I slowed down and allowed her to take the lead. It now dawned on me that, startling as she was, no one else seemed to notice her. One or two people appeared to shiver when they passed her, but as they neither slackened their pace nor turned to take a second look, I concluded they had not actually seen her. Without glancing either to the right or left, she moved steadily on, past Moulton's, the confectioner's, past Perrin's, the hatter's. Once I thought she was coming to a halt, and that she intended crossing the road, but no, on, till eventually she did stop, and we were both preparing to cross over, when an elderly man walked deliberately into her. I half expected to hear him apologize, but naturally nothing of the sort happened. If there was any doubt left in me that she was not of this world, it was quickly dispelled when she passed right through him. A few yards further on she came to an abrupt stop, and then, with a slight inclination of her head, as if meaning me to follow, she glided into a chemist's shop. She was certainly not more than 6 feet ahead of me when she passed through the door, and I was even nearer than that to her when she suddenly disappeared as she stood before the counter. I asked the chemist if he could tell me anything about the lady who had just entered his shop, but he merely looked puzzled and laughed. "Lady?" he said. "You're a bit out of your reckoning, sir. This isn't the 1st of April. What can I do for you, please?" I bought a bottle of formulants and reluctantly and regretfully turned away. That night I dreamed again I saw the ghost. I followed her up George Street, just as I had done in reality, but when she came to the chemist's shop she turned swiftly round. "I'm Jane," she said in a hollow voice. "Jane. Only Jane." and with that name ringing in my ears, I awoke. Some days elapsed before I was in George Street again. The weather had in the meanwhile undergone one of those sudden and violent changes so characteristic of the Scottish climate. The locked gates of heaven had been opened, and the rain was descending in cataracts. The few pedestrians I encountered were enveloped in mackintoshes and carried huge umbrellas, through which the rain was soaking and pouring off from every point. Everything was wet. Everywhere was mud. The water splashing upwards, saturating the tops of my boots, and converted my trousers into sodden sacks. Some weather isn't fit for dogs, but this weather wasn't good enough for tadpoles. Even fish would have kicked at it and kept in their holes. Imagine, then, my feelings when amidst this miserably heavy downpour there appeared a spotlessly clean apparition in blue without either waterproof or umbrella. I refer to Jane. She suddenly appeared as I was passing the Ladies' Tea Association rooms, walking just in front of me. She looked just the same as when I last saw her, spick and span and dry. I repeat the word dry, for that is what attracted my attention most. Despite the deluge, not a single raindrop touched her. The plumes on her toque were splendidly erect and curly. Her shoe buckles sparkled, her patent leathers were spotless, while the cloth of her coat and skirt looked as sheeny as if they had just come out from Keeley's. Anxious to get another look at her, I quickened my pace and, darting past her, turned suddenly and gazed full at her. The result was a severe shock. The impact of what I saw, the ghastly horror of her dead white face, sent me reeling across the pavement. I let her pass me, but still impelled by a sickly fascination, followed in her wake. Outside a jeweler's stood a hansom, quite a curiosity in these days of motors, and as Jane glided past, the horses shied. I have never seen an animal so terrified. We went on, and at the next crossing halted. A policeman had his hand up, checking the traffic. His glance fell on Jane, and the effect was electrical. His eyes bulged, his cheeks whitened, his chest heaved, his hand dropped, and he would undoubtedly have fallen had not a good Samaritan, in the guise of a non-psychical public-house loafer, saved him as he staggered back. Jane was now close to the chemist, and it was with a sigh of relief that I saw her glide in and disappear. Had there been any last doubt at all after my first encounter with Jane as to her being superphysical, there was certainly none now. The policeman's sudden fright and the horse fit of shine were facts. What had produced them, I alone knew, and I knew for certain it was Jane. Both man and animal saw what I saw. Hence, the phantom was not subjective. It was not illusionary. It was a bona fide spirit manifestation, a ghost. Jane fascinated me. I made endless researches in connection with her, and at length, in answer to one of my inquiries, I was informed that 18 years ago, that is, about the time that Jane's dress was in fashion, the chemist's shop had been occupied by a dressmaker of the name of Bosworth. I hunted up Miss Bosworth's address and found that she had retired from business and was living in St. Michael's Road, Bournemouth. I called on her at the first opportunity, told her where I had come from, and came straight to the point. "Can you give me any information," I asked, "about a lady whose Christian name was Jane?" "That sounds vague," Miss Bosworth said. "I've met a good many Janes in my time." "But not Janes with pale yellow hair and white eyebrows and eyelashes," I said, going on to describe Jane in detail. "How do you come to know about her?" Miss Bosworth said after a long pause. "Because," I said, "I've seen her ghost." Though Miss Bosworth hesitated before replying, she made no attempt to ridicule my statement. Instead, she simply sighed and said, "Is she still there?" I thought she would surely be at rest now. "Who was she?" I asked, adding, "Come, madam, you need not be afraid of me. Who is Jane, and why should her ghost haunt George Street?" When she saw my earnestness, Miss Bosworth thought for a moment and then began to speak. "It happened a good many years ago," she said, "in 1892, In answer to an advertisement I saw in one of the daily papers, I called on a Miss Jane Vernelt, Mademoiselle Vernelt she called herself, who ran a costumer's business in George Street, in the very building, in fact, now occupied by the chemist you have mentioned. The business was for sale, and Miss Vernelt wanted a big sum for it. However, as the books showed a very satisfactory annual increase in receipts, and her clientele included a duchess and other society leaders, I considered the bargain a tolerably safe one, and we came to terms. Within a week I was running the business, and exactly a month after I had taken it over, I was greatly astonished to receive a visit from Miss Vernelt. She came into the shop quite beside herself with agitation. "It's all a mistake," she screamed. "I didn't want to sell it. I can't do anything with my capital. Let me buy it back." I listened to her politely, and then told her that as I had gone to all the trouble of taking over the business, and had already succeeded in extending it, I most certainly had no intention of selling it, at least not for some time. Well, she behaved like a lunatic, and in the end created such a disturbance that I had to summon my assistants and actually turn her out. After that I had no peace for 6 weeks. She came every day, at any and all times, and I was at first obliged to take legal proceedings. I then discovered that her mind was really unhinged, and that she had been suffering from softening of the brain for many months. Her medical advisers had, it appeared, warned her to give up business and place herself in the hands of trustworthy friends or relations, who would see that her money was properly invested. But she had delayed doing so, and when at last she did make up her mind to retire, the excitement resulting from so great a change in her mode of living accelerated the disease. Exactly 3 weeks after the sale of her business, she became a victim to the delusion that she was ruined. This delusion grew more and more pronounced as her malady increased, and amidst her wildest ravings she clamored to be taken back to George Street. The hauntings, indeed, began before she died, and I frequently saw her, when I knew her material body to be under restraint, just as you describe, gliding in and out of the showrooms. For several weeks after her death, the manifestations continued. They then ceased, and I have never heard of her again until now. This interview with Miss Bosworth concluded my friend's story, but I then received a letter from him shortly afterwards. In this he stated: "Since my return to Scotland, I have frequently visited George Street, almost daily, but I have not seen Jane. I only hope that her poor distracted spirit has at last found rest." The letter. In my activities as a ghost hunter, I have met many people who expressed the desire to keep watch in a haunted house, but few who actually carried out this wish, and very few who bravely conducted their night sitting alone. Such a man was Mr. Robert Scarf, whose story I now tell. Many years ago now, Mr. Scarf was spending Easter with some friends of his in Aberdeen. Learning from them that there was a reputedly haunted house in the immediate vicinity of the Great Western Road, he begged them to try and get him permission to spend the night in it. As good luck would have it, the landlord appeared to be a connection of theirs, and though at first reluctant to give Mr. Scarf leave, in case he should then be pestered by other people anxious to watch for the ghost, he eventually yielded. So the following evening at 8 p.m., Mr. Scarf entered the premises, taking with him for company a dog named Scott, which had been loaned to him. When the door slammed behind me, I found myself standing in a cold, dark passage, out of which rose a gloomy staircase, suggestive of all sorts of uncanny possibilities. However, overcoming these nervous apprehensions, I began a thorough search of the premises to make sure that no one was hiding there. Descending first of all into the basement, I explored the kitchen, scullery, and larder. The place fairly reeked with damp, but this was not to be wondered at, seeing as the floor was of the very poorest quality of cement, cracked and broken in 12 places, and that there had been no fires in any of the rooms for many months. Here and there in the darkest corners were clusters of cockroaches, while more than one rat scampered away on my approach. Scott kept close at my heel, showing no great enthusiasm in his mission and giving even the rodents as wide a berth as possible. I had a very strong feeling that there was some kind of invisible presence in the basement. It seemed to follow me whichever way I turned. I went upstairs, and still the presence seemed to follow. In one or two of the top bedrooms, and more particularly in a tiny garret overlooking the backyard, the invisible thing seemed inclined to hover. For some minutes I waited there to see if there would be any further developments, but there was none. Obeying a sudden impulse, I then made my way once more to the basement. When we got to the top of the kitchen stairs, Scott showed a decided disinclination to descend further. Crouching down, he started to whine, and when I tried to grasp him by the collar, he snarled viciously. Deciding it was better to have no companion at all than one so unwilling, I descended without him. The stairs terminated in a very dark and narrow passage, into which the doors of the kitchen, larder, and storeroom opened, and at the far end of the passage was a doorway leading to the backyard. The presence seeming to be more pronounced in this passage than anywhere else, I decided to spend the night in it, and selecting a spot opposite the entrance to the scullery, I made a seat out of 2 drawers of the kitchen dresser, placing them one on the other, bottom uppermost, on the floor. It was now 9:30, and the traffic in the street overhead had slackened off. I put out my candle and waited. It was a long, long wait, and when midnight came, the only sounds I heard so far were such trivial noises as the creaking of a board, the flopping of a cockroach, and the growling of the dog. From time to time, I felt my pulse, and even took my temperature to make sure that I was perfectly normal. At 1 o'clock, I ate some chicken and ham sandwiches, which I had helped down with a glass of oatmeal stout. As the minutes went by, I began to think that perhaps, after all, there was no more to the hauntings than the presence I had sensed earlier. But at 2 o'clock, Scott gave an extra savage snarl, and the next moment came racing downstairs. Darting along the passage and tearing towards me, he scrambled up the overturned drawers, and burying his face in my lap, set up the most piteous whinings. A sensation of icy coldness now surged through me, and as I got out my pocket flashlight ready for emergencies, I heard an unmistakable rustling in the cellar opposite. At once my whole attention became riveted in the direction of this sound, and as I sat gazing fixedly in front of me, suddenly the whole passage, from one end to the other, was illuminated by a low phosphorescent glow. I then saw the scullery door slowly begin to open. Seized by a great fear, I crouched against the wall, while the door opened wider and wider. At last, after an interval which was to me seemed like an eternity, a shadowy something loomed in the background of the enlarging space. I felt that another second or so of such tension would assuredly cause me to faint away. The shadowy thing, however, quickly developed, and in less time than it takes to tell, it assumed the form of a woman, a middle-aged woman, with a startling white face, straight nose, and curiously lined mouth, the 2 front upper teeth of which projected considerably and were very long. Her hair was black, her hands coarse and red, and she was clad in the orthodox shabby print of a general servant in some middle-class family. The expression in her wide-open, glassy blue eyes, as they glared into mine, was one of such intense mental agony that I felt the blood in my veins congeal. Creeping stealthily forward, her gaze still on me, she emerged from the doorway, and motioning to me to follow, glided up the staircase. I could not help but accompany her, and so up we went, the woman finally entering the garret which I had examined earlier. She noiselessly approached the hearth, and pointing downward with a violent motion of the index finger of her right hand, suddenly vanished. A great feeling of relief now came over me, and yielding to a natural reaction after such severe nervous strain, I reeled against the window-sill and shook with laughter. Recovering, I carefully marked the spot on the floor indicated by the apparition, and descending into the basement to fetch Scott, left the house, and made hurried tracks to my friend's home, where I was allowed to sleep until late in the day. I then returned to the haunted house with the landlord and one of my friends. It was decided to raise the boarding in the garret, and under it, at the marked spot, we discovered a stamped and addressed envelope. As a result of our combined inquiries, we learned that a few years previously the house had been occupied by some tradespeople of the name of Piblington, who, some 6 or 7 months before they left the house, had in their employment a servant named Anna Webb. This servant, whose description corresponded in every way with the ghost I had seen, had been suspected of stealing a letter containing a postal order, and had hanged herself in the cellar. The letter, I gathered, with several others, had been given to Anna to post by Mrs. Piblington, and as no reply to the one containing the postal order was received, Anna was closely questioned. Being a nervous woman and highly strung, the inquisition threw her into deep confusion, and her embarrassment being construed into guilt, she was threatened with prosecution. She thereupon took her life, but not before leaving a note. As a proof of my innocence, she scribbled on a piece of paper, which was produced at the subsequent inquest, "I am going to hang myself. I never stole your letter, and can only suppose it was lost in the post." The mere fact of the accused woman committing suicide seemed to point to her guilt, and as the postal order was never traced, it was generally concluded that Anna had secreted it and had been only waiting till inquiry ceased and the affair was forgotten to cash it. Of course, the letter I found was the missing one, and although apparently hidden with intent, the fact of its never having been opened seemed to suggest that Anna really was innocent, and that the envelope had by some extraordinary accident fallen unnoticed by her through the crack between the boards. Anyhow, its discovery put an end to the disturbances in the house, and Anna, whether guilty or innocent, was never seen walking there again.